Hi, welcome to Detours, Understanding Acquired Brain Injury. This is Unit 3, Chapter 1 of Genes and Chromosomes. We will be discussing briefly in this unit laws and principles of genetics, inheritance, which were discovered by the Polish priest Gregor Mendel. Mendel, he studied pea plants and patterns of inheritance. And these developed into the laws of genetics. I won't bore you talking about pea plants, but these principles that he discovered apply to everyone. They apply to anything, any plant, any animal that reproduces sexually. So this is the kind of thing I suspect that all of you who've had some kind of biology, you're familiar with some of these terms and things like that, but we will review that and talk a little bit about how it applies. First, though, there's some necessary vocabulary before we get into these laws of heredity. First, the word trait. What's a trait? A trait is a characteristic that is a distinguishing feature of an organism. Eye colors, hair color, thickness of the myelin sheath around a neuron, the lifespan of a white blood cell. All these things are traits. Traits obviously vary from person to person. Another term, allele, this describes genetic variations of a trait. Alleles for eye colors, for example, blue, green, brown, amber, gray. These are all alleles for the trait of eye color. When it comes to Mendel's genetics, it's usually describing two variations, but obviously it's more complicated than that. But still, when it comes to Mendel's laws, this mainly describes traits that come in two types. Now, we'll talk about the term genotype. A genotype describes the genes specifically that an organism will inherit from its parents, even if they aren't necessarily expressed as traits, because an organism can still pass traits to its offspring, even if they're not necessarily expressed. Phenotype is the traits that you actually see expressed. Traits follow these Mendelian principles and other genetic principles, which we will get to later. A trait that always expresses itself in an organism's phenotype, regardless of whether it's inherited from one parent or both, is called a dominant trait. So a trait that always shows itself is dominant. A trait that will only express itself if it's inherited from both parents is called a recessive trait. So dominant trait always will show itself regardless of whether it just comes as one copy from mom or dad, but a recessive trait must be inherited from both parents. All right, so a trait that is passed from one generation to the next in the genotype but not expressed in the offspring is called a carried trait. You hear this often with relation to diseases, like being a carrier for hemophilia or something like that, meaning that somebody in their genes, they carry that trait, but it's not expressed in the phenotype, as in it doesn't show up necessarily in that person, but they have the gene for it and then could pass it to their children in turn if they meet somebody who has likewise is carrying that trait. So just so you're aware, just because you have something in your genes doesn't mean you'll express it as your phenotype, which means the physical expression of traits. All right. If characteristic from both parents for a trait is identical, hair color, let's say, or eye color, something like that, is identical, we will say somebody is homozygous. Homo meaning same, zygous, zygote. The zygote has the same genes for a trait. They are homozygous. If an allele from parents differs for a trait, like again, hair, eye color, whatever, then we say they are heterozygous, means that there's a difference between parents, eye, hair color, whatever, pick something. Now, the important thing to understand how that works then and how dominance works in relation to that is if brown eyes are a good example. The gene for brown eyes is dominant over blue eyes. Although, in truth, eye color is regulated by multiple genes. But for simplification, just thinking about it as though it were for one, brown eyes tend to be dominant just because, they are so much darker. And so really any change over top of the lighter colors, that's why it was always thought of as being a single gene, because it just shades out any other colors. We will get to a genetic explanation in a little bit. But back to brown eyes being dominant. You still can carry the trait for blue eyes, but the brown eyes will be dominant in your phenotype and what expresses itself. So even if mom gives you the trait for brown eyes, dad's got blue eyes, you in yourself will express in your phenotype the dominant brown eyes, even though you have a genotype, a heterozygous trait for brown eyes. It means your genotype has a recessive trait, but it's not going to express itself because it's recessive. As we said, recessive traits only express themselves if both genes are the same. And they're not. And it would be the same, any kids you have a much higher chance if you have a partner then who also has blue eye, who has genes for blue eyes. We will get into that when we start talking about Punnett squares and things like that, but not at this point. Nevertheless, it's important to know that the difference between homozygous, where, for example, if your parents both had brown eyes, your mom, your dad, you are homozygous for that trait. And you will then definitely show with brown eyes, and you cannot pass on any genes for anything else. Whereas if you're heterozygous, you can pass on genes for blue eyes. Even if your phenotype shows you with brown eyes, you still can potentially to your children pass on that trait, because you are heterozygous means that you have the potential for, in the next generation, something other than brown eyes, but shows up as brown in your genes. All right. So let's get into the specific Mendelian laws now that you have some of the vocabulary. All right. First, Mendel's first law is the law of dominance. Some alleles are always dominant. If an organism inherits a dominant allele, it will always express itself. So if we know something is dominant, you will always see it express itself. And there's some like dimple in your chin, or the baldness. That one is also dominant. Okay. Law of segregation. During gamete production, sex cell production, paired alleles separate equally. So offspring inherit only one allele from each parent. And we talked about this, that the genes, the units for inheritance, divide up, and they're not connected with each other. But we discovered this isn't entirely true, and we will get to this in the next chapter. All right. Finally, the law of independent assortment. Alleles of different genes sort independently. One gene does not influence the inheritance of another. Alleles of different genes are not supposed to affect the inheritance of another. It is important to keep in mind that to Mendel, when we say allele, that does not equal gene. He didn't understand the concept. We weren't at that point yet. It was 18th century, early 19th, and he did not understand. Nobody understood genetics yet. But what he did say was basically if you inherited one trait, you wouldn't necessarily have another. That traits weren't necessarily linked. So this is kind of true, but there are other factors that play a role. But it is important to understand that very few traits are only controlled by a single gene or more abstractly by one allele. All right, it's true, just wrapping this up, with a passage of 200 years, there definitely have been some new discoveries. And as we take a break at this point and you understand the basic laws of Mendel, the law of dominance, that there will always be some genes that are dominant over others, that the law of segregation, that during gamete production, paired alleles separate equally, so they only get one allele from each parent. The law of independent assortment, that alleles of different genes will sort independently. I mean, that really sums up. But there are some unusual or some new discoveries. So we'll stop here and tell you, please click like and subscribe. Don't forget the bell icon. Please share with anyone who may find this interesting. Please, any questions below? We'll see you next time. Bye.